Hey there, Night Wanderer. Glad you found your way here. Tonight's journey? We're heading straight into the dusty chaos of the Crusades, but forget everything you learned from storybooks or shiny documentaries. This isn't about noble quests and divine destiny. It's about mobs with swords, broken maps, heat stroke, holy relic theft, and some of the worst logistical decisions in human history. Now, just pause for a second. Today, we've got Google Maps, bottled water, and international law. Back then, you had superstition, chainmail, and a vague hope someone packed extra bread. Spoiler, they didn't. So, before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, hit that like and subscribe button if you genuinely enjoy the content I create. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? It honestly makes my day to see this community growing. People from all over the world tuning in, connecting through weird, forgotten corners of history. And I'm incredibly thankful you're here. Now, let's begin. Why the Crusades were worse than you thought. And yes, they were already bad. So, you live in medieval Europe. Congratulations. You've made it to a time when diseases are airborne, God is everywhere, and bathing is suspicious. Your average day involves stale bread, backbreaking labor, and praying your local lord doesn't have a bad mood and a new axe. Then, one day, the world changes. It's 1095, and Pope Urban II, the most influential man in Europe, and the only person whose hat has more square footage than his house, gives a speech in Clermont, France. In it, he claims Christian pilgrims are being harassed in the East. He says Muslims are defiling the Holy Land. He says Jerusalem must be liberated. And then the punchline. If you go fight, all your sins will be forgiven. That's right. Eternal salvation, no confession needed. You could be a murderer, a thief, or the guy who farted in church every Sunday. It doesn't matter. Just grab a sword, walk thousands of miles, and start swinging. Heaven awaits. The crowd goes feral. Nobles, knights, monks, peasants, even that guy who never shuts up about fish, all begin chanting. Deus vult, God wills it, like it's a sports chant. Overnight, what started as a call for help turns into Europe's worst group project. But here's the problem. No one knows what they're doing. There's no command structure, no supply chain, no map. Some don't even know where Jerusalem is. It's just that way. So off they go, tens of thousands of people, wearing crosses sewn to their tunics and packing everything from swords to goose feathers. Someone really did bring a goose. It was believed to be guided by the Holy Spirit. It was not. They march from village to village, begging for food, occasionally burning things, and generally behaving like your worst road trip companions multiplied by 10,000. Entire towns empty out. People sell their homes. Kids are dragged along. Dogs, too. And before they even leave Europe, things get dark. Some crusader mobs decide that if they're going to fight non-Christians, they might as well start early, by massacring Jewish communities in the Rhineland. These were not sanctioned military actions. They were holy pogroms, fueled by religious fervor and unchecked ignorance. The Church, conveniently, does very little to stop it. This isn't just a war, it's a continent-wide panic attack with swords. The Pope wanted an army. What he got was a chaotic flood of zealots, mercenaries, opportunists, and devout maniacs, stumbling eastward like a divine conga line. And they've only just crossed the French border. So begins the First Crusade. Not with strategy, not with skill, but with a lot of yelling and a shocking lack of common sense. The Holy Land lies thousands of miles away. Most of these people won't make it. Some won't even survive the week, but they're marching anyway, because God wills it. All right, let's hit pause and try to wrap our heads around this wild mess of religious chaos, not to make it clearer, but to embrace the confusion. Because if you've been picturing the Crusades as some neat, heroic timeline full of noble knights and epic quests, yeah, you're in for a letdown. And honestly, maybe a little rage too. There wasn't one crusade. There were 8 major ones, plus a bunch of unnumbered sequels, heresy hunts, and unhinged fan expansions. The first crusade kicked off in 1096. The last one fizzled out in 1272. That's nearly 2 centuries of marching, dying, pillaging, praying, and mispronouncing Jerusalem. The First Crusade, surprisingly successful. Against all odds, and possibly against God's own patience, the Crusaders managed to capture Jerusalem in 1099. After years of starvation, infighting, and committing unspeakable war crimes, they entered the city and killed almost everyone in it. Muslim civilians, Jewish families, Eastern Christians, it didn't matter. The streets literally ran red. The scribes wrote poems about it. The Second Crusade, a flaming, papal-endorsed mess. It was launched in response to the fall of a minor crusader state, but once the Western armies reached the Levant, they couldn't agree on where to go or how to do anything. They marched around, botched a siege in Damascus, and went home in shame. Result, 0 gains, lots of graves. The Third Crusade? That's your Hollywood content, featuring Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, and enough dramatic tension to fuel 47 documentaries. They fought a lot, made treaties, didn't recapture Jerusalem. But Richard went home with the kind of reputation that makes up for actual failure. Legends are funny like that. The Fourth Crusade? Oh boy, didn't even try to reach the Holy Land. Instead, the Crusaders got sidetracked, couldn't pay their Venetian shipbuilders, and ended up sacking Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christianity. They looted churches, melted relics, and declared victory over the wrong religion entirely. The Pope was furious. For a few minutes. Crusades 5 through 8, copy-paste disaster. They tried Egypt, failed, tried Tunisia, failed, tried enthusiasm, that also failed. Fewer knights joined, fewer battles were won. The dream was fading, and everyone kind of knew it. Let's not forget the side quests, the Children's Crusade, thousands of kids sent off in 1212, thinking innocence alone could reclaim Jerusalem. Many died. Some were sold into slavery. One group never made it past Marseille. If it sounds like a moral fable about misplaced idealism, it's because it literally is. Then there were the Northern Crusades, against pagans in the Baltic. The Albigensian Crusade, against heretical Christians in southern France. Crusading didn't stay pointed at Muslims for long. It expanded to include Jews, pagans, Greeks, and eventually anyone the Pope didn't like. What did these nearly 200 years of bloodshed actually accomplish? Not much. The Christian grip on Jerusalem was temporary at best. The Muslim world ultimately pushed them out. East and West Christian churches split harder. Europe bled people, gold, and sanity. And interfaith relations? Yeah, those never really recovered. But the Catholic Church got wealthier. Europe learned how to build bigger castles, and knights got very good at creative excuses. So if you're trying to cram the Crusades before a history quiz, just remember this. It was messy. It was long. And it was marketed like salvation, but executed like a group project where everyone forgot the assignment. In theory, these were pilgrims. In practice, they were a mobile disaster zone held together by wool, wishful thinking, and someone yelling Deus vult every few minutes like a medieval hype man. The early Crusaders weren't organized armies. They were people who woke up one morning and said, "You know, what sounds like a good idea, walking to the Middle East with no training, no map, and a goat. And they did. You could join as long as you had limbs and believed Jerusalem was east of wherever you were standing. That was it. No military service required. No application form, no age limit. You could be 12 or 70. One guy joined with a kitchen ladle as his only weapon. Another was reportedly followed by a duck, which the rest of his group claimed was clearly chosen by God. They saw themselves as pilgrims on a divine journey, but with swords, armor, and more looting than you'd expect from someone on a holy mission. The cross stitched on their tunics made them feel invincible, like a medieval passport and bulletproof vest rolled into one. They brought their families, their friends, sometimes their chickens. One group included an entire marching band made of pots and spoons. These weren't soldiers. They were a religious circus. And as they marched, they begged, then demanded, then just stole things when people stopped giving. If a town refused to feed them, that town became suspicious or heretical, and therefore worthy of being robbed or burned to the ground. Even other Christians couldn't stand them. Crusading mobs would trample monasteries, loot sacred relics, and set barns on fire just for being in the way. There are recorded cases of bishops literally barring their church doors from the oncoming pilgrims. And when they weren't fighting locals, they were fighting each other. Germans versus French. French versus Italians. Italians versus common sense. Disputes broke out over where to camp, how to pray, and who got to sleep closest to the relic that may or may not have been St. Peter's toenail. One priest was tackled during Mass because someone thought he was hoarding blessed bread. A brawl broke out over a misinterpreted Latin chant. In short, these weren't disciplined warriors. They were a rolling catastrophe powered by divine conviction and meat stew. And Jerusalem? Still hundreds of miles away. But who needs direction when you've got momentum? God wills it. It started as a roar, a unifying battle cry echoing across Europe. But somewhere in the swamps of Anatolia, between vomiting up bad goat meat and being bitten by your fourth flea of the morning, it turned into a whisper, or worse, a question. God wills this? At first, everything felt blessed. Marching under the cross, every hardship was a test of faith. Every blister was a sacred offering, every missing toe, probably divine pruning. But after weeks of dehydration, starvation, dysentery, heat stroke, and hallucinations, things started to unravel. Water was scarce. Bread turned moldy in hours. Horses dropped dead mid-step. And the weather swung between biblical drought and surprise hailstorm. People started seeing visions in the dust. One night claimed St. Michael appeared in his stew. Another tried to talk to a tree that sounded holy. They kept walking because stopping meant death, and dying might mean missing out on the Pope's forgiveness package. Everyone still hoped that martyrdom had a fast lane to heaven, especially since the alternative was being eaten alive by infected blisters. To keep spirits high, priests held daily masses. But nothing kills a sermon like someone vomiting blood mid-hallelujah. Attendance dropped. Faith remained, but barely, like a candle trying to survive a wind tunnel. Superstition started replacing belief. People kissed relics before battle. Others wore charms made from donkey bones. One group carried a pig skull they said belonged to a Christian martyr. It didn't. But morale was low, and nobody wanted to be that guy. Some stopped praying entirely. They just walked, mumbled something holy under their breath, and hoped no one noticed their spiritual battery was dead. Still, the cry lived on. Deus vult. Mostly as a meme, or to end arguments, or shouted by someone charging headfirst into the next bad decision, and when they finally reached enemy lines. These were not radiant, righteous warriors of God. They were half-mad, mud-caked survivors of a road trip gone violently off-script. The Pope said, "Go to Jerusalem." And the entire continent said, "Sure. Which way is that?" Geographic knowledge in medieval Europe was, let's say, optimistic. Most people had never traveled beyond their own village. They thought maps were either blasphemous or decorative. Some believed Jerusalem floated above the earth. One chronicler placed it next to the moon. So the Crusaders walked east, or what they hoped was east. Some got lost immediately. One group made it to the Balkans and asked locals if they'd reached the Holy Land. The locals were like, "Sir, this is a vineyard." Medieval maps didn't help. They were basically Pinterest boards for the devout. Jerusalem in the center, surrounded by vague mountains, lions, serpents, and instructions like, "Here be sin." If you were lucky, you found a compass. If not, you followed the guy with the loudest voice and the straightest stick. Getting lost was common, so were accidental sieges. Crusaders frequently attacked the wrong cities, either because they thought they were Muslim or because they just needed supplies and decided a little righteous pillaging never hurt anyone. One town got razed because the Crusaders didn't understand the language and assumed they were being insulted. Some groups wandered so far off course they ended up in Egypt or stuck in swamps. Others doubled back unknowingly, convinced they had circled the devil's influence. The devil, apparently, looked a lot like a hill they'd seen 6 times already. They rejected local guides, calling them pagans or tricksters. One poor translator was hanged after someone misheard valley as ambush. Another guide said, "Turn left," and they burned his village out of caution. All the while, Jerusalem remained elusive, a distant prize at the end of a zigzagging, half-literate pilgrimage of confusion and incorrect turns. But to be fair, they did eventually get there. Mostly by accident. The idea was noble. Wear armor, stay alive. But no one told the Crusaders that marching through the Middle East in a medieval tin can was less protective combat gear and more slow cooker for human misery. Armor in the 11th century wasn't sleek. It wasn't ventilated, and it definitely wasn't designed for the climate they were about to suffer through. Most knights wore chainmail, thick iron rings layered over padded cloth. Great for deflecting swords. Less great for surviving 110-degree heat with no shade and fewer electrolytes. Once you strapped it on, you were committed. There were no hydration breaks, no medieval Gatorade, and if you thought you'd take it off for a breather, good luck. It required a squire, a prayer, and the strength of 10 peasants just to peel the sweat-slicked metal off your body. The result? Crusaders were slow, exhausted, and permanently marinated in their own suffering. Heat stroke was rampant. Dehydration was expected. Some knights fainted mid-march. Others hallucinated holy visions. One guy claimed to see the Virgin Mary in a sand dune. Turned out to be a dying camel. Feet blistered, armpits festered. Chafing reached apocalyptic levels. Soldiers limped, scratched, and occasionally wept while trying to unsaddle their thighs from metal saddles that had become medieval air fryers. And horses? Oh, the horses. They hated every second of it. Covered in armor, burdened with supplies, and being whipped toward Jerusalem by sweaty maniacs. Some simply lay down mid-march and refused to get up. Honestly, relatable. The sun wasn't their only enemy. Armor rusted from sweat and humidity. Sand stuck to every joint. One knight got so many grains of grit inside his helmet that his eyebrows eroded. That's not hyperbole. That's crusading. Still, they clanked on. Why? Because armor meant status. Taking it off made you look weak. You'd rather boil inside a metal prison than let Brother Philip the Armless call you soft. So onward they marched, glinting under a sun that hated them. God might have willed the crusade, But the armor? That was clearly the devil's design. In medieval Europe, bathing was a suspicious activity. Some believed it opened your pores to sin. Others just didn't like getting wet. Combine that with months of marching, sweating, fighting, and general spiritual panic, and you've got the Crusades, history's longest-running BO experiment. Picture it. Tens of thousands of unwashed men wrapped in wool and iron. No deodorant, no soap, no spare clothes, just layers upon layers of grime, sweat. And that one guy who brought cheese in his pockets. Your average crusader smelled like a cheese wheel dipped in feet and disappointment. Entire camps reeked like fermented despair. Even the flies avoided them. Some knights started storing herbs in their helmets just to survive their own stench. And the bugs loved it. Lice, fleas, bedbugs. If it could crawl and bite, it was living rent-free on your body. Crusaders scratched constantly, during meals, during prayer, even while charging into battle. It was less holy war and more human flea circus. Washing your clothes, forget it. Water was for drinking, barely. You wore your tunic until it fused with your skin. When someone did wash themselves, they were either a noble or mentally unstable. There was no in-between. Tents became sweat lodges. Blankets were stiff with buildup. Boots could stand up on their own from sheer filth. And God help you if you shared a sleeping area with someone who thought garlic counted as hygiene. Add in the dysentery, foot rot, and pus-filled wounds, and you've got a fragrance best described as sanctified decay. The worst part? No one noticed. Everyone smelled terrible. You could walk into camp covered in filth, rotting from the feet up, and the only comment would be, "Brother, you look blessed." Sainthood was easier to earn than a bath. The Crusades were supposed to be about fighting non-Christians. That was the pitch. Free the Holy Land, defend the faith, fight the infidels. Clean, simple, morally righteous, at least on paper. But the reality? Crusaders started running out of official enemies pretty quickly. So they got creative and paranoid. And suddenly, everyone was a heretic. It didn't matter if you were Muslim, Jewish, Eastern Orthodox, or just wore the wrong hat at Mass. If you looked different, prayed differently, or didn't instantly kiss the Pope's figurative ring, you were now on the heresy watch list. The Orthodox Christians, technically fellow believers, were high on the suspicion list. Why? Because they used different rituals, spoke Greek, and didn't acknowledge the Pope's divine supremacy. That made them probably evil, according to crusaders with half a Bible and no cultural sensitivity. Jews? Let's not even pretend they stood a chance. Crusader mobs slaughtered Jewish communities across Europe before even leaving for the Holy Land. Entire towns in the Rhineland were wiped out. Not because of battle, but because someone with a sword and a superiority complex decided that purging unbelievers was part of the plan. And then came the real innovation: accusing each other. Did your fellow crusader sleep in too long? Heretic. Did he question the plan? Heretic. Did he have shinier armor than you? Obviously, a tool of the devil. Heresy became the medieval version of "I don't like you," with significantly bloodier consequences. One chronicler describes a knight being stabbed for reciting psalms suspiciously. Another was accused of witchcraft for bringing dried herbs to camp. Spoiler, it was basil for soup. This wasn't about faith anymore. It was about control, about fear, and about having an excuse to eliminate rivals and loot their tents. Confessions were extracted under torture. Trials were swift, theatrical, and usually fatal. Victims were burned, beheaded, or thrown off cliffs, sometimes all three if the priest was having a particularly intense day. Even monks weren't safe. Entire orders were labeled heretical for minor disagreements over theology. Do you believe Christ was fully divine and human? Great, but if your phrasing was slightly off, enjoy being roasted alive for heresy. Eventually, it became clear. The Crusades weren't just about fighting other religions. They were about enforcing one narrow, brutal version of faith and silencing everyone else, even if they were on your side. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to reclaim Jerusalem. That was the plan. Noble, goal, clear purpose, holy war version 4.0. What could go wrong? Everything. It started with money. The Crusaders needed ships. Venice had ships. Venice also had capitalism. So they made a deal. Sack the city of Zara, a Christian city, to pay off the debt. The Pope said no. They did it anyway. The Pope excommunicated them, then forgave them. Medieval leadership was a bit flexible. Then a Byzantine prince shows up. Promises gold, an army, and religious unity if they help him reclaim the throne in Constantinople. Crusaders, low on funds and high on poor decisions, say, "Sure, what's the worst that could happen?" They arrive in Constantinople. The locals hate them. Tensions rise. The prince doesn't pay. The Crusaders get angry, very angry. So they do what every devout army does when betrayed by a client state. They sack the most important Christian city in the East, and not gently. Churches looted, relics stolen, monks killed, women assaulted, palaces burned. One group rode their horses into the Hagia Sophia, just to prove a point. They stole everything not nailed down, then pried up what was. The city burned for days. Priceless icons were melted down. Saints' bones were sold as souvenirs. Even the Pope, who initially supported the idea, was horrified. For a moment. Then he accepted a few relics and moved on. The Crusaders never made it to Jerusalem. They stayed in Constantinople, founded a Latin empire. It lasted 57 awkward, bloody, dysfunctional years before collapsing like a poorly made tent. The Eastern and Western Christian churches never recovered. The schism widened, trust shattered, brotherhood dead. The Fourth Crusade became the ultimate holy mission fail. A war that never reached its target, caused more harm to its allies than its enemies, and proved that sometimes the road to hell really is paved with good intentions and bad credit. Ah, the medieval knight. Poster child of the Crusades, glorious, noble, chivalrous, dipped in righteousness and polished to a divine sheen. Or at least, that's how the brochures sold it. In reality, what we actually got was a loud, sweaty, often inebriated disaster, wrapped in clanking metal and questionable theology. The myth is magnificent. Armored saints charging into battle, eyes full of purpose, banners flying, hearts pure. But peel back the chainmail, and what you'll find underneath is a second-born noble with no land, a bad attitude, and a tendency to start fights over soup. You see, most knights didn't go crusading out of divine obligation. They went because they weren't the heir. They weren't getting the family castle. So the Pope's offer of fight for Christ and earn eternal glory sounded a lot like grab whatever you can, stab whoever gets in the way, and maybe come home with something shiny. They were trained for war, sure, swinging swords, jousting, looking impressive in daylight. But endurance, diplomacy, logistics, basic hygiene, optional. And by optional, I mean aggressively ignored. On the road, knights were walking medieval mayhem. They bullied peasants, shoved pilgrims out of the way, demanded free meals from monasteries, and called it God's will. If they ran out of wine, someone got stabbed. They didn't follow orders, they didn't share, and they treated maps like suggestions drawn by heretics. If the bishop said, "Turn left," the knights were already galloping into a forest, shouting, for glory. They fought constantly, not just with enemies but with each other. Disagreements broke out over tents, horses, and who was hogging the holy relics. One knight accused another of looking too smug in his tunic and challenged him to a duel. Both ended up wounded. The tunic survived. Knights hoarded supplies, broke alliances, and routinely ignored battle plans because charging in blind felt more honorable. When commanders said, "Hold the line," they heard, "dramatically disobey." When scouts reported ambushes, knights said, "Sounds like a shortcut." And then came battle. Yes, some fought bravely. Some held the line. Some even remembered which side they were on. Others panicked. One unit famously charged their own camp, mistaking it for the enemy. Another arrived late to a siege because someone misread the moon. It was a new moon. That's just dark. After battle, forget strategy. Loot first, questions never. They stormed villages, burned archives, stole everything not nailed down, then demanded a blessing. They saw themselves as chosen, holy warriors, heaven's favorite murder interns. But really, most were just overgrown toddlers in steel pajamas, tantruming their way through the Levant with a horse and a sword. They prayed with bloody hands. They confessed between looting sessions. They fasted if there was no food. And if someone dared criticize them, heresy. Obviously. Sure, some were legends. A few even earned it. But most? They were liabilities with lances. The human equivalent of a cannon with no aim and a really loud backstory. Knights in shining armor. More like knights in dented ego and disappointment. Lots of that. Sieging a city during the Crusades wasn't a science. It wasn't even art. It was more like a spiritual group project powered by catapults and bad assumptions. The plan: show up, surround the city, yell some threats about divine judgment, and hope God does something dramatic. Like open the gates, or magically crumble the walls. Spoiler, he didn't. So instead, you camped outside. You built siege towers out of trees you chopped down 5 minutes ago and hoped they didn't collapse the moment you climbed them. You launched rocks, insults, and flaming debris, and then you waited, and waited, and waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The army that arrived in formation now resembled a muddy, plague-ridden music festival with worse hygiene and no music. Food? Gone. Water, mosquito soup, morale, somewhere between maybe we're cursed and can we eat the bishop's mule? Disease tore through camps. Soldiers went from God wills it to God, please stop. Siege engines, trebuchets, rams, towers were slapped together like IKEA kits, missing half the bolts. One tower collapsed before it reached the wall. Another caught fire when a knight tried to light a torch for drama. One group built a battering ram so heavy it couldn't be moved. They used it once, as furniture. Then came the tunnels. Oh yes, medieval mining warfare. Dig under the city walls, weaken the foundation, and collapse it. Genius, until your tunnel collapses on you. Because reinforcement wasn't invented yet, and structural engineering was apparently heretical. So yes, many crusaders were buried by their own tunnels. Some never made it out. Others popped up inside enemy latrines. Surprise! When the siege dragged on, and it always dragged, things got worse. Infighting, starvation. Someone tried to barter a relic for a chicken. Another knight refused to fight unless he was given a new tunic and a better tent view. The bishop blessed a catapult and got booed when it misfired. Eventually, someone, usually the hungriest, would yell, "Let's just charge!" And they did. Right into a wall of flaming arrows, boiling oil, and giant stones launched by people who were very ready. Knights were flattened. Ladders snapped. One guy made it to the top of the wall, slipped, and took out 3 of his own men on the way down. But on the rare occasion, the truly miraculous occasion, when the city finally fell, all strategy went out the window. What came next was chaos. Total chaos, looting, screaming, fires, soldiers grabbing whatever wasn't nailed down. And if it was nailed down, they unnailed it with enthusiasm. Homes, temples, people, all considered spoils of war. One knight claimed a door as his divine reward. Another stole an entire donkey stable. Then, once the screaming stopped, they held mass in the ruins, declared the destruction holy, and argued over who deserved the most credit while standing ankle-deep in ashes and someone else's bookshelf. This was medieval siege warfare, where plans were dreams, and suffering was guaranteed. Some chapters in history make you laugh, some make you angry, and then there's the Children's Crusade, where the only logical response is to stare at the page, whisper, "Wait, what?" and sit in stunned silence for a few seconds. Because yes, this happened. 1212. France and Germany. Thousands, yes, thousands, of children set out to take back Jerusalem. Not knights, not pilgrims, children, barefoot, hungry, starry-eyed with faith. Some were teenagers, many were as young as 7. They didn't carry swords, they carried crosses made of wood, and hoped that didn't know better. It started with a shepherd boy named Stephen, somewhere in France, who claimed Jesus appeared to him in a field. The message: "Go to Jerusalem, take back the Holy Land. No army needed, God will guide you." And word spread fast. Soon, crowds of children from across France and Germany began marching. They believed, they really believed, that the seas would part, that angels would protect them, that their innocence alone would open gates and soften swords. They sang hymns as they walked, starved as they marched, prayed as they bled from blistered feet. And no one stopped them. Parents, powerless, priests, conflicted, nobles, uninterested. The church didn't organize it, but it didn't stop it either. Adults stood on the sidelines and watched as children walked, hungry and sunburned, across Europe to reclaim a holy city they'd never seen in a land they couldn't pronounce. Most towns just let them pass. Some gave bread, some gave coins. Others gave nothing at all. Many just looked away. By the time the children reached Marseille, they were ragged, broken, and exhausted. But they still believed. They waited for the sea to part. Spoiler, it didn't. But don't worry, local merchants had an idea. Free ships to the Holy Land, they said. And the children believed that too. 2 ships sank in a storm. Everyone on board, gone, the others, sailed straight to North Africa, where the children were, sold into slavery. That's right, slavery. Faith didn't save them. The church didn't save them. Nobody saved them. The rest of the children, those who didn't board the ships, wandered aimlessly, broken by hunger, disease, and disappointment. Many died on the roads. Others were taken in by strangers. Most were never heard from again. The Children's Crusade wasn't a war. It wasn't even a crusade. It was a mass tragedy wrapped in the language of innocence, fueled by blind faith, and ignored by the very people who claimed to speak for God. And it's maybe the clearest proof we have that when belief goes unchecked, when emotion overtakes reason, even the purest hearts can be led off a cliff. Thousands of children walked toward Jerusalem. None reached it. They walked for faith, and were met with silence. In October 1097, the Crusaders reached Antioch, a massive walled city in modern-day Turkey, considered the gateway to the Holy Land. They had high hopes, low supplies, and no plan. The siege began, and it would become one of the most infamous disasters in crusading history. The city itself was nearly impregnable. Huge walls, dozens of towers, food and water inside. Meanwhile, the Crusaders camped outside in the mud, under the open sky, with dwindling rations and escalating infections. Welcome to medieval real estate. No plumbing, but plenty of plague. At first, they held on. They shouted at the walls. They built siege towers. They dug under the foundations. None of it worked. The defenders laughed. The Crusaders starved. Food ran out. Horses were eaten, then dogs, then rats, then, eventually, corpses, yes. The Siege of Antioch gave us one of history's darkest footnotes, Crusader cannibalism. Several sources confirm it. One knight roasted a Saracen's body. Another sliced flesh off the dead and declared it tough but filling. Chroniclers recorded it in detail, not as horror, but as a weird badge of honor. We were so holy, they seemed to say, that we didn't die, we just ate each other. Morale was at rock bottom. So naturally, a miracle happened. A monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have visions. Christ told him, he said, that the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Jesus' side, was buried beneath a church in the city. They dug all day, nothing. More digging, still nothing. Then, surprise, Peter himself found it. Was it staged? Almost certainly. Did it work? Absolutely. The relic, real or not, lit a spiritual fire under the starving masses. Faith surged. Hope returned. And with the lance held high, they launched a desperate last-ditch attack. They won. Somehow. Maybe it was divine intervention. Maybe it was sheer madness. But Antioch fell. Then the Crusaders got trapped. Inside the city, a massive Muslim relief army surrounded them. The besiegers became the besieged. Again, food ran out. Again, panic spread. Again, Peter had visions. This time, Jesus said, "Don't worry, you'll win." And they did. Again, through another miracle assault, fueled by faith, desperation, and probably a little bit of human jerky. Antioch was theirs, at the cost of their dignity, sanity, and stomachs. When you picture a crusader's sword, your brain probably cues the epic music. A gleaming blade, forged by master smiths, kissed by angels, glowing with righteousness and cinematography. Yeah, no, the real thing? Rusty, lopsided, held together with twine and wishful thinking. Welcome to medieval warfare, where the sword of God was usually an iron plank with a handle. Most of these blades weren't forged in secret mountain forges by elite armorers. They were banged out in your local blacksmith's backyard, next to the pile of horseshoes, soup pots, and bent nails. If the sword didn't fall apart after one battle, it was considered elite-tier craftsmanship. Handles were wrapped in cracked leather, or rope, or cloth, or in one case, some guy's dead brother's belt. Cross guards bent out of shape, pommels fell off mid-swing, and edge sharpness was an optional feature. A lot of knights just swung wildly and prayed the sheer force of confusion would cause injury. And yet, these swords were sacred. Before battle, they were blessed by priests, dunked in holy water, kissed by monks, and waved through incense like they were being baptized. Crosses were carved into the hilts. Relics were tied to the pommel. One knight even duct-taped a tiny vial of holy dust to his blade for spiritual impact. It shattered on first contact. He got dust in his eye and was taken off the field. But to the Crusaders, the sword wasn't just a tool. It was a spiritual extension, a physical embodiment of divine fury and masculine overcompensation. This hunk of rusty metal wasn't there to cut, it was there to smite. Maintenance? Forget it. Sword care manuals weren't a thing. You didn't oil the blade, you didn't clean it. You wiped it on your own tunic, or, if you were feeling festive, on the corpse of someone holier than you. One knight claimed blood kept it sharp. Science disagrees. And what about the other weapons? Battlefields were graveyards of broken tools, cracked axes, spears bent like boomerangs, knives so dull they could barely butter bread, shields split like old firewood, siege weapons that creaked with every moral compromise. And then there were crossbows, the new hotness, the tactical game changer, simple, brutal, deadly. And guess what? The Pope hated them. He called them unchristian, said they were too efficient, too deadly, too cold and unspiritual for proper holy killing. So naturally, crusaders used them anyway. A knight might carry a blessed rosary in one hand and a crossbow in the other. Balance. Meanwhile, most foot soldiers didn't even have weapons. They brought whatever they had at home. Farming tools, butcher knives, sharpened sticks. One brave soul reportedly charged into battle with a pitchfork and a Bible. Inspirational. Also ineffective. He did not make it to Jerusalem. But here's the thing. They still fought, they swung, they stabbed, they prayed, because no matter how broken or bent or blunt the weapon, it still carried the weight of belief. A sword, even rusted, could be a bridge between man and myth. To the crusader, the sword wasn't about steel. It was about purpose, even if it looked like it belonged in the trash heap behind the blacksmith's shop. By the time the Crusaders reached the arid deserts of the Middle East, one thing became painfully, and we mean literally painfully, clear. These people had no idea how hydration worked. Water, as it turns out, is kind of important. You need it to think, to function, to not die face down in the dust. But during the Crusades, water was a cruel joke, a myth, a shimmering promise on the horizon that either didn't exist or was guarded by someone with a sword and a very strong no trespassing policy. Clean water? Rare. Rivers? Muddy. Wells? Poisoned, dry, or occupied. Springs? If you found one, you'd better be ready to fight like it's the Holy Grail, because it practically was. So what did they drink? Anything. Beer, wine, goat milk, rainwater, mystery puddles, sweat off a tunic. Some chewed wet leaves, others collected dew off their tents. One knight tried to drink the condensation off a donkey's back. He did not live long. Dehydration was a daily routine. Lips cracked, tongues swelled, skin peeled like overcooked bread. Some knights mistook mirages for angels. One man dropped to his knees and started praying to a rock he believed was St. Peter. He wept. The rock did not respond. Meanwhile, your body, falling apart. You couldn't sweat, you had nothing left. Your joints creaked, your breath reeked. And bathing, not happening. Water was too valuable for that kind of luxury. You didn't bathe, you fermented. Tunics rotted, armor chafed. Skin blistered under salt, sand, and desperation. Whole camps smelled like goat stew and foot fungus. Even the horses were uncomfortable. And when, by some miracle, someone did find water, all hell broke loose. Fights broke out. Crusaders trampled each other. Knights elbowed monks. One group was so desperate to bless a spring that they accidentally drowned the priest while pushing him forward to sprinkle the holy drops. Oops, no water? Disease. Too much water? Also disease. Dysentery ripped through camps like a plague sponsored by poor life choices. Skin infections spread. Lips bled. People lost teeth from dry rot. One knight lost his voice permanently from dehydration. Another lost his mind. He claimed his shadow was whispering water recipes. Still, they marched. Because apparently, suffering was part of the spiritual package deal. Drink too much, sin of gluttony, drink too little, test of faith. Die from dehydration in the desert because your commander thought the well looked suspicious. That's just crusade core. They believed God would provide. God did not. So they carried on with cracked lips and failing kidneys, fueled by divine delusion and half a cup of stale wine. The Crusades weren't just about battle. They were a slow dehydration ritual, disguised as a holy war, endured by men who thought the sweating was optional and water was just a bonus. Who needs hydration when you've got blind faith and a rusty sword? Everyone, actually. Everyone needs water. When people back in Europe imagined the Holy Land, they thought of divine light and spiritual purpose. A land kissed by God, dotted with sacred temples, filled with peace and maybe a few choirs. What the Crusaders found instead was a sun-blasted rock garden with aggressive locals, unbearable heat, and sand in every crevice. Think less biblical paradise, more angry sauna with knives. The weather was the first betrayal. Most Crusaders had never experienced true desert heat. Wrapped in heavy armor and wool, they were like walking cauldrons. Helmets became ovens. Chainmail cooked skin. Knights baked in their own gear, leaving behind trail markers in the form of collapsed, heat-stroked comrades. There was no shade. Trees were rare. Tents turned into sweatboxes. Water was a distant memory, and sunscreen hilarious. The result? Sunburn so severe that skin sloughed off like a snake shedding sin. Then there was the terrain. The land wasn't flat. It was steep, rocky, and cruel. Feet blistered, ankles twisted, horses stumbled, men tripped on thorns and cactus roots while cursing every prophet ever mentioned in Sunday school. And the bugs, oh, the bugs. Flies, mosquitoes, scorpions. Crusaders spent half their time swinging at invisible enemies and the other half scratching like devout maniacs. The cities weren't welcoming either. Locals were understandably unimpressed by thousands of screaming foreigners trying to reclaim real estate they hadn't seen in 500 years. Fights broke out. Arrows flew from ramparts. Markets refused service. One town started charging admission just to look at a well. Language barriers didn't help. Every conversation turned into wild gesturing and religious shouting. Misunderstandings were frequent. One crusader asked for directions and accidentally insulted someone's grandmother. Result: 3 dead, 12 injured, 0 helpful maps. Still, they trudged forward. Because this land was holy. It had been walked by saints, touched by Christ. That's what they were told. But what they felt was sunburn, exhaustion, and a growing suspicion that God's will might involve a lot more limping. The Holy Land didn't feel sacred. It felt like divine punishment with sandstorms. When Pope Urban II gave the green light for the First Crusade in 1095, he probably envisioned something noble. Maybe a righteous army marching eastward to reclaim Jerusalem. A sacred mission. Holy banners. Stirring hymns. Spiritual fulfillment. What he got was closer to a flaming caravan of spiritual chaos. Because while the Pope said, "Take up your cross, march to the Holy Land and protect your fellow Christians," what the Crusaders heard was, "Do whatever you want." God says it's fine now, and oh boy did they. Villages looted, towns burned, entire communities wiped off the map. And this wasn't just enemies, this was anyone. Christian, Jew, pagan, heretic, merchant, monk, didn't matter. If your town didn't offer free food, hostile. If you didn't speak Latin or genuflect the right way, suspicious. If you asked, "Why are you stealing my goat?" Clearly the devil's trickery. Torch it all. Crusader logic was simple. If it wasn't nailed to an altar, it could be taken. If it was nailed to an altar, the altar got looted too. Some bands didn't even wait to get to the Holy Land. They started their crusading in France and Germany by marching into Jewish communities in the Rhineland and turning them into mass graves. Entire neighborhoods burned, families murdered, Why? Because they weren't Christian enough, or maybe because their houses were nicer. These weren't soldiers. These were fanboys with swords and a divine hall pass, led by self-appointed prophets with zero training and a strong sense of moral superiority. Did Pope Urban II mean for this to happen? Probably not. Did he publicly condemn it, loudly and clearly? Also, number. The church stayed quiet, politely distant, occasionally wringing its hands while looking the other way. As long as the Crusaders kept marching east, the Vatican was fine, letting a few towns burn along the way. Even Byzantine Christians, technically allies, weren't spared. They were Eastern Orthodox. Different rituals. Bearded priests. No Pope allegiance. That was enough to make them suspicious. And in Crusade logic, suspicious equals heretical, and heretical equals flammable. Crusaders would roll into a town, demand food and shelter, and if the locals hesitated, "You dare deny God's army? Enjoy your surprise heresy trial, now with 100% more fire." Sometimes towns were burned just for being nearby. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong accent. One city was looted because a crusader claimed he saw a demon in the window. It was a cat. And the justification? Always the same. We're doing this for God. As if divine love required arson, theft, and the occasional public hanging. Later on, a few church officials tried to rein it in. They issued rules, suggested restraint, proposed that maybe murdering peasants and setting monasteries on fire wasn't the best way to spread the gospel. They were ignored. Because once you tell thousands of armed men that God wills it, and send them off with no supervision, no training, and a boatload of emotional baggage, you've essentially handed out blank permission slips for moral collapse. The First Crusade wasn't just about Jerusalem. It was about what happens when faith meets fire, and no one brings a bucket. The Crusades were sold as a unified Christian mission, a brotherhood of the faithful, marching together under one cross toward one sacred goal. What they actually were was Europe's most chaotic road trip. A caravan of noble egos, grumpy knights, and passive-aggressive bishops, all pretending to get along. Crusader camps were a disaster. French nobles refused to take orders from Germans. Germans thought the Italians were too greedy. The English showed up late and got into fights because someone pronounced "Amen" wrong. Everyone blamed everyone else for poor rations, bad weather, and strategic blunders. Alliances formed and collapsed in the span of a goat roast. One day you were sharing relics, the next someone's accusing your squire of stealing a sandal, and now you're dueling at dawn. Leadership was fractured. There wasn't a single unified command. Instead, there were half a dozen noblemen, each convinced God had personally appointed him to lead. Decisions were delayed, reversed, or outright ignored, depending on who felt insulted that morning. One siege nearly failed because the commanders argued over who got to attack first. The enemy, meanwhile, watched and waited with popcorn. Religious unity didn't help either. Everyone was Christian, but some were Catholic, others were Orthodox, and some were, "Whatever gets me out of this mud hole alive." Disputes over rituals turned into fistfights. A bishop was once pelted with bread for saying the wrong version of the Lord's Prayer. And don't forget the personal vendettas. Crusaders were nobles, and nobles loved nothing more than decades-long blood feuds. Cousins refused to speak. Brothers sabotaged each other. One knight filled another's boots with goat dung and claimed it was holy compost. Even priests got caught up in the drama. Sermons turned into shouting matches. Confession lines ended in sword fights. Monks wrote angry hymns about their tent neighbors. "O Lord, smite the man who snores at night," was probably chanted more than once. In theory, they were united by faith. In reality, they were a medieval reality show. One camp, 20 nobles, infinite grudges, only one Jerusalem. The Crusades began with a sermon. Pope Urban II stood before a sea of hopeful faces and preached salvation through violence. "Take up the cross," he said. "Liberate Jerusalem. Defend the pilgrims. Save your soul with steel." It sounded holy, stirring, purposeful, and for about 5 minutes it probably was, but then it wasn't. Because once you give tens of thousands of people a holy mission and zero accountability, you don't get spiritual discipline. You get a traveling apocalypse with church bells. Very quickly, religion stopped being the compass and started being the justification. Want to burn down a village? God wills it. Want to steal wine from a monastery? Spiritual thirst. Want to bash a guy's head in because he looked at your sword funny? Divine judgment. The Crusades became a religious buffet where every crime could be seasoned with scripture. The line between faith and frenzy? Gone. Erased in ash and hymnals. Marching east? That alone was seen as penance, no matter what you did on the way. Kill a heretic? Saint points. Kill a fellow Christian because he stole your boots? Still holy. Just make sure to confess after breakfast. Crusaders believed that the act of crusading, just being there, was a divine cleansing process. One massacre at a time, as if every arrow they fired came pre-blessed, as if every town they looted carried God's signature at the bottom of the scroll. Massacres? Blessed? Looting? Sacramental? Torture? Spiritual therapy? Even stealing relics was reframed as escorting holiness to a more faithful home. Because, obviously, St. Augustine would rather live in France than in the village he'd rested in for 500 years. They burned cities, then held mass in the ruins. They slaughtered civilians, then sang psalms over the ashes. One group reportedly looted a church, took the gold altar, and then used it as a dining table, while thanking God for their blessed bounty. In another town, crusaders tied up local priests, accused them of heresy for not speaking Latin, and executed them during evening prayers. And nobody blinked. Because they weren't killing people, they were serving righteousness. Religious leaders didn't just allow it. Many encouraged it, wrote glowing letters, penned official pardons, gave blessings to campaigns that had less to do with Jerusalem and more to do with pillaging the nearest village with bad luck and poor defenses. It wasn't about protecting the faith anymore. It wasn't even about theology. It was about wearing religion like armor, not to protect themselves, but to excuse themselves. Excuse the blood, excuse the greed, excuse the urge to commit atrocities and call it piety. The Crusades began with a sermon. They ended with that sermon whispered over corpses, sung in looted churches, and echoed by people who believed that God had personally signed off on every single one of their worst impulses. The image of the Crusades is often bathed in sunlight. Dusty pilgrims marching across golden plains toward Jerusalem. In reality, it rained, constantly. The journey started in Europe, and Europe is wet. The Crusaders marched through France, Germany, Hungary, the Balkans, all of it mud. Thick, angry mud that swallowed wheels, tripped horses, and turned every Crusader boot into a 10-pound squelch device. It didn't stop there. Rivers overflowed, bridges collapsed, tents became soggy disasters. One army camped in a low valley and woke up underwater. Another lit a fire to dry their clothes, then accidentally burned their entire supply cart. Wet armor rusted, wet food rotted, wet humans smelled like boiled sin. Mold grew on everything. Blankets turned green. One knight reportedly tried to baptize his feet after seeing mushrooms growing between his toes. Marching in this mess was a nightmare. You slipped, you sank. and sometimes you just sat down and cried into your wet soup. Horses refused to move. Men got lost in the fog. Maps turned to pulp. Morale drowned in every puddle. Crusaders fought each other over dry rocks. One noble built a tiny wooden platform for his tent and charged rent. Another faked a miracle involving sunshine just to skip patrol duty. The rain didn't cleanse them. It just soaked everything they believed in. The Crusades were branded as a spiritual calling, a sacred act: march to the Holy Land, free Jerusalem, and receive eternal salvation. What could be more divine? Turns out nearly everything. Because while the Church envisioned a war led by prayerful men under the watchful eye of Christ, what they got was a horde of adrenaline-fueled crusaders who believed stabbing a stranger was just part of the baptism process. The Pope's promise of indulgence, total forgiveness for sins if you joined the crusade, was like handing out golden tickets to morally compromised teenagers. Crusaders took it to mean they could do anything, so long as they were heading east with a cross stitched to their tunic. Before battle, priests offered mass and blessings. After battle, the same men were looting corpses, burning cities, and bragging about it in confession, because they knew they'd be absolved. One knight reportedly killed a man, knelt beside the body, and prayed on him for forgiveness. Practical, if nothing else. Swords were routinely blessed. Not with logic, just water and Latin. One crusader engraved a psalm into his blade, which did nothing for his victims but helped him sleep at night. Another claimed his blade hummed when pointed at unbelievers. It was later discovered he had tinnitus. Holy relics were used like lucky charms. A saint's tooth here, a thorn from the actual crown there. Some even tied them to weapons. One man went into battle wielding a crossbow with a splinter of the true cross on the bolt. He missed. The splinter hit a cow. The cow died. He called it divine targeting. Knights chanted scripture as they rode into war, not out of devotion, but because shouting Deus Vult sounded cooler than let's get them. Religious fervor was weaponized. It wasn't enough to defeat your enemy. You had to humiliate them in God's name, mock them, desecrate their shrines, leave your sword stuck in their altar and call it art. And yet they still saw themselves as holy. Because holiness wasn't about mercy or justice, it was about winning. God helped those who helped themselves, preferably with a mace. To question any of this was to doubt the mission. Doubters were labeled heretics, cowards, or French, which, to some crusaders, was worse. The soul was still part of the Crusades. It was just brought along for the ride, tied to the back of the horse, clutching a hymnal, and hoping not to get trampled. While chroniclers of the Crusades wrote epic tales of sieges, swords, and saints, they forgot to mention the feet and the blisters. So many blisters. The march to the Holy Land wasn't just long, it was an orthopedic disaster. Crusaders walked thousands of miles across rocks, mud, snow, sand, and metaphorical broken dreams. Their footwear? Homemade leather, tied with hope and string, designed more for medieval cosplay than continental traversal. Most boots didn't last more than a few weeks. Some fell apart instantly. Others mutated into damp, bacteria-lined foot traps. Toes rubbed raw, heels split open. Arches collapsed like papal promises. Each step brought new pain, a sharper limp, and deeper resentment toward whoever said, "God wills it." Blisters started small, annoying, ugly things. But soon they grew, swelled, burst, got infected. A knight might ride into battle with a lance, but die from a pinky toe the size of a walnut. One poor soul had a blister so large his squire carried it in a pouch as a holy relic. Another tried to lance his own with a dagger and nearly bled out, prompting the phrase, death by tow. There were no medics, just priests with oil and vague advice. Some tried wrapping their feet in linen. Others smeared them with mud. One particularly devout group dipped their blisters in holy water. It didn't help, it just made them wet and cursed. Hygiene was not a thing. Foot washing was rare and seen as suspiciously luxurious. Removing your boots could get you laughed at, or worse, recruited as a living example of martyrdom. Walk through pain, they were told. Suffering purifies the soul. So they did. Shoes were traded like currency. Some stole from corpses. Others made new soles from flattened helmets. One creative squire wore bread loaves tied with string. He was eaten by dogs. Even those lucky enough to ride horses weren't spared. Stirrup blisters. Saddle sores. One noble had to be lifted on and off his mount because his thighs were more blister than skin. The other knights called him Sir Weeping Knees. And yet no one stopped. They limped forward, cursed forward, hobbled with the determination of pilgrims whose pain was both badge and burden. Blisters didn't kill the crusade, but they sure made every holy mile feel like Judgment Day. They trained for war, they marched for God, but nothing prepared the crusaders for their most persistent enemy, their own intestines. Welcome to the Dysentery Diaries. The moment crusaders left home, their guts started plotting against them. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, spoiled food, stress, and zero understanding of hygiene combined to create a perfect storm of gastrointestinal misery. And when it struck, it didn't just knock. It kicked the door down, set fire to your dignity, and left you weeping behind a bush. Symptoms were brutal. Abdominal cramps that made grown knights cry, fever, vomiting, and the main event, relentless, explosive diarrhea. Entire armies were reduced to crawling latrine lines. Fields behind camp turned into minefields of shame. Latrines, when they existed, were just holes in the ground, or shallow trenches quickly overwhelmed by supply and demand. Those lucky enough to survive the battlefield often fell to what one chronicler euphemistically called a furious flux. Some soldiers lost more fluids than they consumed, turning into weak, trembling husks, clutching their stomachs and begging God for a pause in the purge. Camp stench was legendary. You didn't smell like a crusader until you smelled like one. Uniforms were ruined. Cloaks became makeshift diapers. People marked clean areas with sticks, flags, or prayers, none of which worked. Medical care was worse than the disease. The standard treatment included fasting, good luck, herbal infusions, mostly grass, and bloodletting, because sure, why not drain more fluid? One priest swore by bitter wine and ashes. Another insisted that reading scripture out loud near the latrines might ward off satanic influence. Spoiler, it didn't. Dehydration killed more than swords. Entire platoons had to halt not for enemy attacks, but because too many men were too busy squatting and sobbing. One knight collapsed mid-charge after soiling himself in full armor. His name was forgotten. His example remembered. And yet dysentery was treated as a necessary trial, a purification. If you weren't leaking, were you even devout? Some chroniclers called it a divine humbling. Others skipped the topic entirely, probably out of trauma. Forget chivalry. The true crucible of the Crusades was surviving 3 weeks of pudding bowel misery with only a tunic and a prayer. At the start of the Crusades, the mission was clear. Fight the Muslims, liberate Jerusalem, save the souls. But clarity is boring. So naturally, the longer the journey went on, the more enemies started popping up out of thin air, or rather, out of fear, hunger, exhaustion, and good old-fashioned ignorance. At first, they turned on each other. Germans didn't trust the French. French knights thought Italians were greedy. Englishmen didn't understand anyone and didn't want to. Disagreements over camping space, prayer posture, or who stole my cheese quickly escalated into fistfights. One noble was accused of heresy because he used the wrong Latin when blessing his bread. Then came the Allies. Eastern Christians and the Byzantines were technically on the same side, but their priests wore different hats, used Greek in church, and didn't kneel the right way. Clearly heretics. Some crusaders decided the safest thing to do was raid them just in case. Next, Jews. Entire communities were slaughtered in Germany before the Crusaders even crossed the Alps. Why? Because they weren't Christian, were nearby, and had money. It wasn't strategy. It was convenience wrapped in spiritual justification. Then there were locals along the road. Peasants, farmers, monks, who became suspects simply for existing too close to Crusader supply routes. If a village didn't offer food, it was accused of witchcraft. If a farmer looked too calm, he was a spy. One man was hanged for possessing an evil chicken. Paranoia snowballed. Crusaders started seeing Satan's influence in everything: weather, blisters, weird smells. Anyone with a limp might be possessed. Anyone with a different accent, probably planning a betrayal. Crusaders began burning towns for the sin of bad vibes. Enemy lists grew longer than supply lists. Accusations flew faster than arrows. And the war, which had started as a mission to liberate Jerusalem, devolved into a roving festival of spiritual fear, mob justice, and unfiltered xenophobia. By the end, no one really knew who the enemy was anymore, but they sure knew how to light a torch. You've got your sword, your shield, your unshakable spiritual enthusiasm. You've marched across Europe. You're ready to fight heathens, heretics, and whoever else gets in the way of your heavenly destiny. What you're not ready for? Bugs. Not metaphorical bugs, not a minor inconvenience. I'm talking apocalyptic swarms of bloodthirsty, disease-ridden insects with no respect for Crusader chivalry. The moment the Crusaders set foot in the Levant, they realized their next great adversary wasn't an army. It was airborne, six-legged, merciless, and they never ever retreated. Mosquitoes. Not your casual backyard mosquito. Number. These were militant, highly organized squadrons, specially trained to find the one exposed patch of skin under 50 pounds of iron and pierce it with surgical precision. Crusaders would lie down to sleep and wake up looking like leper prototypes. One knight counted 47 bites on his face alone. Another tried to invent a helmet made of netting and prayer. It failed. The mosquitoes just flew up his nose. And the itching? That was just the warm-up act, because it wasn't just about discomfort. It was about disease. Malaria ripped through Crusader camps like divine punishment. Typhus joined the party. Fevers spiked. Men shook, hallucinated, and ranted. One bishop got so delirious he stripped naked, shouted, "I am the vessel of fire," and dove headfirst into a puddle. He was never the same. Then came the lice, the fleas, the flies that laid eggs in wounds. Your armor, a walking insect hotel, your blanket, crawling, your hair, probably not yours anymore. Crusaders scratched themselves raw. Nails wore down, skin tore. One monk got so desperate he used a knife. He got sepsis. Because of course he did, and the bugs did not discriminate. Nobles, peasants, Templars, cooks, all got bitten. Even the horses, especially the horses. Crusaders blamed the bites on sin, on heat, on each other. One guy blamed the Jews. Got bitten mid-rant, which is exactly the kind of divine comedy medieval history loves. They tried everything: garlic, vinegar, smearing themselves in mud, wrapping in cloth, praying, chanting, fasting. One knight stood in the desert and screamed at the sky for an hour. The bugs applauded. then bit his eyelids. They burned incense. Slept in tents sealed with wet rags, buried herbs in the corners of their beds. Nothing helped. Because even in God's holy war, the insects had home field advantage. They were fast. They were persistent. They were unholy little demons with wings. And they were winning. The great clash of civilizations? Delayed, because half the army was down with fever, scratching at their wounds and begging saints for ointment. The spiritual mission? On hold. You can't fight for Jerusalem when you've got boils in your armpits and a beetle in your boot. The Pope may have promised paradise, but the insects got there first. Ah yes, the Crusades. History's most overhyped road trip, complete with swords, saints, spiritual overconfidence, and absolutely zero logistics. Let's talk supply chains, or, more accurately, the black hole where planning should have been, because these weren't small groups. These were mass migrations of thousands: men, women, children, livestock, banners, horses, carts, relics, and at least one guy dragging a broken organ because it plays holy sounds. And the plan? We'll figure it out. Crusader supply strategy in a sentence: leave home, bring 2 snacks, and assume God will handle the rest. At first, spirits were high, breads were packed, cheese was shared, salted meat was slapped on saddles like divine beef jerky. Some even brought wine for hydration. Sure, buddy. But then week 2 hit, food spoiled, bags tore. Sacks of grain leaked out behind carts like trails of regret. One guy definitely ate the entire group's figs during night watch. Another accidentally set the bread on fire while praying too close to the campfire. And once they ran out of food, well, that's when the real plan kicked in. Steal everything in sight and call it holy. They begged from towns, demanded donations from monasteries. If a village refused to feed them, congratulations, you're now heretics. Your barn is burning, and we're looting your butter churn in the name of Christ. Water, same disaster. Clean springs were rare. Wells were guarded. Rivers were suspicious. So they drank from mud puddles, dug holes near goats, and blessed swamp juice with desperate prayers. One night drank his horse's bathwater. Another swigged vinegar. One guy licked dew off a rock and claimed he saw the Virgin Mary in the reflection. Dehydration hit hard, so did dysentery. Leaders tried to keep morale up. One commander, watching his entire supply cart roll off a cliff into a ravine, famously muttered, "It's fine. We'll eat virtue." Spoiler, you can't. And when they did find supplies, absolute chaos. Soldiers fought over moldy biscuits. Wine turned rancid. Pilgrims bartered relics for dried lentils. One group boiled their leather boots and ate them. Bonus, still tasted like regret. But wait, it gets worse. Some Crusader lords brought chefs. Real European chefs, fancy ones. Trained in castle kitchens to roast duck and plate pheasant with herb garnish. What happened when the goose ran out? They ate the chef's dog. One knight said it tasted blessed, and yet somehow the march continued, limping, starving, occasionally hallucinating Jesus in a burnt crust of bread. Because nobody, not a single planner, priest, or prince, thought to assign a logistics officer. Why? Because planning is for peasants. And these guys believed faith would fill your stomach. It didn't. But it sure gave them something to chew on. Okay, so picture it. You're a crusader. You've marched across Europe, dodged bandits, survived hunger, outlasted a siege, and possibly argued theology with a donkey. All you want now is a moment of rest. And that's when the mosquitoes show up. Not normal ones, not the lazy, half-hearted garden variety. These are biblically aggressive, demon-grade bloodsuckers. possibly trained by Satan himself. They don't just bite, they swarm. One moment you're praying. The next, you're an all-you-can-eat buffet with legs, and sure, the bites itch. But the real nightmare? Disease, malaria, typhus. Mystery fevers with names like the burning flux. Crusaders spent more time scratching than sword fighting. One guy tried to scratch with a sword. Bad idea. And we're just getting started. Enter lice. In your clothes, in your beard, inside your blanket. One guy shaved his head and still got reinfested. A priest said lice were a test of faith. Another claimed they were tiny demons sent to humble the proud. Neither could sit still through Mass. Next up, fleas, ticks, flies that laid eggs in wounds. Yes, really. Get bitten, start bleeding, get infected. Boom, all before lunch. Sleeping, forget it. Every tent sounded like a choir of scratching, slapping, and quiet sobbing. One knight cut his hand open, trying to kill a beetle on his chest. Another declared war on his pillow and threw it in a river. The bugs followed him. Some tried remedies: garlic, vinegar, chanting. One guy smeared himself in mud and claimed to be invisible to bugs. He wasn't. Another bathed in goat's milk. The bugs thought it was dessert. By week 6, your squad had named their parasites. A tick named Gregory, a flea named Salvation. One knight confessed his sins to a louse. Nobody laughed, too itchy to joke. Even the horses were suffering. Crusader armor turned into portable bug condos. Blankets moved on their own. Sweat? That was perfume to the parasites. They came for your ankles, stayed for your eyeballs, found religion in your armpits. You thought you came to the Holy Land for glory. You stayed for the insect apocalypse. Forget swords. Forget banners. The real currency of the Crusades wasn't blood. It was relics. And yes, we're talking about body parts. Bones, fingernails, teeth, hair. Anything vaguely human that could be labeled holy and sold in a velvet pouch. Crusaders didn't just march for God. They marched to snag a little piece of Him to take home. And the hustle was real. Once a city fell, boom, straight to the churches. Crusaders bypassed treasure vaults and made a beeline for reliquaries. Anything shiny, ancient, or remotely sacred-looking got scooped up, repackaged, and rebranded as definitely belonged to Saint someone. You think that's a splinter from the true cross? Congratulations. So did 47 other churches across Europe. One bishop had enough fragments to build a small deck. Another had 3 separate skulls of John the Baptist, one as a child, one as an adult, and one labeled backup. The Crusader rule of thumb was simple. If it's weird, old, and slightly sticky, it's holy now. Tooth in a box, St. Stephen, dust in a jar, ashes of a martyr, chicken bone with a crack in it. Clearly a rib from a 4th century saint who fasted a lot. Merchants got in on it too. Pilgrims arrived in the Holy Land and immediately hit the souvenir stands. Want a pebble from Mount Sinai? We've got 50. Vial of Mary's milk? Sure, just ignore the goat hair floating in it. One guy tried selling air, yes, bottled air, allegedly breathed by Jesus. It was literally a goat bladder full of nothing. But wait, it gets wilder. Knights began fighting over relics, like actual sword fights. Crusaders beheaded a fellow soldier because he claimed the cloth he found was from Christ's shroud. Turned out it was a laundry rag. Another group kidnapped a monk for refusing to share the toenail of St. Andrew. He was ransomed for a jar of pickled olives and a handshake. Back in Europe, churches bragged about their acquisitions. Want pilgrims? Show off your new relic. Didn't matter if it was real. Faith was about presentation. The more relics you had, the more pilgrims came. Pilgrims meant donations. Donations meant power. It was religious tourism meets medieval eBay, and of course, forgeries exploded. Some monks literally made fake relics out of animal bones and candle wax. One abbey displayed a feather and claimed it fell from an angel's wing during the Ascension. Another sold a belt worn by Saint Joseph in Bethlehem, tailored in France. In the end, the relic business was less about holiness and more about hustle. The Crusades may not have brought peace, but they definitely brought the church an unlimited supply of random bones and awkward conversations. The holy relic hustle wasn't about proving God's presence, it was about cashing in on his leftovers. Let's talk about crusade finances, or as historians like to call it, high-risk medieval gambling with a side of divine bankruptcy. Because going on crusade, expensive. You couldn't just grab your sword and go. You had to fund travel, food, horses, ships, armor, bribes, tithes, relic insurance, extra rope, and a bonus donkey because one would definitely die before you reached Byzantium. So how did crusaders pay for all this? They liquidated their lives. Lords mortgaged castles. Peasants sold farms. Knights pawned family heirlooms. One noble sold his entire village for the equivalent of a fancy horse. And yes, people took loans, big ones, from people who knew exactly how to profit off your spiritual desperation. Enter the Italian merchants, Venice, Genoa, Pisa. These guys weren't just boat builders. They were military lenders with contracts, clauses, and compounding interest before compounding was even a word. Venice, in particular, mastered the game. You want ships? No problem. Just help us sack a rival city on the way. We'll call it a divine detour. That's how the Fourth Crusade ended up attacking fellow Christians. Oops, finance over faith. And when the Crusaders couldn't pay back their loans, well, now Venice owned a port, or a town, or half of Constantinople. Collateral was everything. Meanwhile, the Knights Templar became the Vatican's unofficial credit card processor. These warrior monks weren't just holy fighters, they were international bankers. Crusaders deposited gold with them in Europe, received a secret code, and cashed it out in the Holy Land. No lost coins, no bandits, just a monk with a ledger. Templars even loaned money to kings. One French monarch owed them so much he tried to dissolve the entire order a century later, through arrests, torture, and one very suspicious trial. Every step of the crusade was tangled in cash. Want forgiveness? Pay a tithe? Want food? Bribe a captain? Want to not starve outside a walled city? Better hope your baron didn't lose the food budget in a dice game. And when victories happened, loot was sold fast. Holy relics on the market. Church bells melted, ancient manuscripts used as fire starters. Everything was a transaction. Faith became a franchise. Forgiveness, for sale, salvation, sold in installments. One pope even offered indulgences to people who funded crusades instead of fighting in them. That's right, holy war got outsourced. In the end, the Crusades weren't just about reclaiming Jerusalem. They were a billion-dollar blunder wrapped in parchment. If there's one thing the Crusades were fantastic at, it was overachieving in the intolerance category. Because while they were supposed to be about liberating Jerusalem, saving pilgrims, and earning heavenly bonus points, the Crusades quickly turned into a centuries-long global roast, and not the funny kind. More like the entire town goes up in flames kind. And they didn't even wait to get to the Holy Land. Nope. Before the First Crusade had even crossed the Alps, Crusader mobs in Germany were already slaughtering Jewish communities in places like Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. Why? Well, because they weren't Christian enough, or rich, or convenient scapegoats. Pick a reason, any reason. Entire families were massacred, synagogues destroyed, scrolls burned. The Pope issued a soft "please don't," but the knights were too busy purging to care. One chronicler called it zealous cleansing. That's medieval for communal genocide. Once they got to the Holy Land, it was open season on everything that moved. Muslims, obvious targets. The Crusaders saw them as occupiers, infidels, enemies of Christ. But mostly, they just saw them as a reason to swing a sword. When Jerusalem fell in 1099, the Crusaders stormed through the city and butchered thousands. Men, women, children. Unarmed civilians, people hiding in mosques. Even fellow Christians were killed in the chaos. Oops. They didn't discriminate by religion, they discriminated by breathing. Jews were burned alive in synagogues. Muslims were beheaded in streets. Eastern Orthodox Christians, who were technically allies, were mistaken for the enemy and slaughtered just in case. And it didn't stop there. Heretics, executed. Dissenters, burned. People who asked too many questions, hanged for confusing the faithful. One monk was arrested because he said God might love peace more than war. Heresy. Into the fire with him. Another was accused of witchcraft for carrying herbs. A priest called it demon salad. He didn't make it. Tolerance wasn't just discouraged, it was punished. To question the mission was to question God, and questioning God was treason. And treason, well, flame time, in Crusader law being different was a crime. Speaking Arabic, suspicious. Wearing the wrong cross, executable. Practicing Judaism, death. Publicly disagreeing with the bishop, double death. And it was all done in the name of righteousness. After every massacre, the Crusaders prayed. They held Mass. They sang hymns, in buildings still echoing with screams. Then they wrote about it in flowery Latin, using words like cleansed and purified. And then they marched to the next town. Rinse, repeat, repent later. It's important to know, this wasn't a glitch. It was a design feature. The Crusades didn't spread faith. They spread fear. They didn't convert. They conquered. And where conversion failed, fire worked just fine. So yes, the Crusades had many sides. But tolerance? Yeah. That side never made the trip. So, by now you've figured out the Crusades weren't exactly Sunday school on horseback. But here's the real kicker. It wasn't just that they killed a lot of people. It's that they believed doing it made them holy. Welcome to the ultimate moral loophole of the medieval era, redemption through murder. Let's set the scene. You're a knight, you've sinned, a lot, you've stolen, you've probably stabbed your cousin over a goat. Maybe you haven't been to confession in ever, but that's okay, because now you're going to the Holy Land, and according to the Pope, one good massacre can erase your entire rap sheet. Kill for God, earn forgiveness, literally stab your way to salvation, and they took it seriously. Crusaders weren't just fighting battles, they were performing ritual violence, cleansing sin with blood, slashing their way into heaven with swords instead of sermons. One knight reportedly murdered 20 unarmed men during a siege, and then immediately confessed it, to a priest who blessed him for it. God works through steel, he said. That steel was probably still dripping. Massacres were marketed as miracles. After the fall of Jerusalem in 1099, Crusaders waded through knee-deep blood and called it divine glory. Historians today call it genocide. But back then, just good branding. And it wasn't limited to the battlefield. Executions were theatrical, public, holy. Suspected heretics were burned alive while crowds sang hymns. One bishop reportedly wept while lighting the pyre. "I do this in love," he said. Sure, of course you do. Redemption became a business model. Crusaders believed each drop of blood shed in God's name was a deposit into their eternal bank account. Martyrs died for God. Crusaders, They killed as God's agents. The logic was bulletproof and terrifying. The more brutal the act, the deeper the cleansing. Slaughter a city, pure. Execute a child, holy necessity. Torch a mosque, spiritual exfoliation. It didn't matter how violent you were. If you wrapped it in scripture, it was righteousness. If you lit it on fire, it was purification. If you questioned it, you were next. It wasn't about spreading belief, it was about proving dominance by turning faith into justification for horror. And they told themselves, this is what God wants. Because when you're holding the sword and writing the gospel, God always agrees with you. The Crusades were brutal, bloody, filthy, which means, of course, that people got injured constantly. And when you're 900 miles from home, bleeding from a boiling oil burn, who do you turn to? That's right, a medieval doctor, aka the guy who probably just sharpened his knife on a rock and prayed over it. Welcome to Crusader medicine, where science was mostly just guessing, and most treatments started with leeches and ended with screaming. Let's begin with battlefield wounds. You take an arrow to the leg, bad luck. You're carried off to the nearest tent. There's a man in robes. He smells like garlic, wine, and something vaguely fishy. He has no tools, no sterilization, no anesthesia, just hope, herbs, and an overwhelming amount of confidence. If it's a flesh wound, he'll pour vinegar on it. If you scream, that means it's working. If it's deeper, he might try cauterizing it with a hot iron pulled straight from the fire. Fun fact, they called it sealing the wound. You'll call it screaming until you pass out. Infections, very common. Treatment, prayers, more vinegar, maybe bloodletting. They believed bad humors had to be released. So yes, your body is rotting, and the solution is to drain it further. Broken bones were wrapped in wooden splints. That's the good version. The bad version? Amputation with a saw, a belt to bite down on, and someone holding your legs. Even dental care was a nightmare. Toothaches? Yank it out. No numbing, just a quick prayer and a firm grip. One monk removed 6 teeth from the wrong side of a patient's mouth. The demons confused me, he said. Sure. Oh, and let's talk diagnostics. Got a rash? Sin. Fever? Also sin. Coughing blood? Demonic imbalance. One priest treated a migraine with 3 Hail Marys and a slap. The learned ones believed in humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Every problem could be blamed on one of those. Bleeding was the solution to most things. One knight bled so much from repeated treatments, his friends nicknamed him Saint Puddle. And then there were the miracle cures. Pilgrims lined up to drink holy water mixed with powdered saints. Spoiler, it was mostly dirt, but they swore it cured headaches. Or possibly gave you worms. Who can say? Mental illness? Forget it. If you were depressed, confused, or just cried too much, you were labeled possessed. The treatment? Chain you to a wall until either the demon or your will to live gave up. In the end, medieval medicine wasn't medicine. It was ritualized suffering, with extra bleeding. So the next time someone tells you they want to go back to simpler times, remind them those simpler times involved healing a stab wound with moss and a Bible verse. Picture this, a knight in shining armor. Except, wait, that armor is dented, the chainmail smells like goat, and the only part that looks polished? The horse. Welcome to the bizarre fashion priorities of the medieval crusader. In theory, knights were elite warriors. In practice, they were fashion influencers with swords. And nothing showed your piety like spending 40 gold coins on a custom horse barding while your own helmet had a hole from last year's battle. Horses were the real stars of the Crusades. War horses, destriers, were massive, temperamental, and armored better than half the infantry. Custom-fitted breastplates, padded caparisons, embroidered silk wraps, gilded reins. Some wore tiny visored helmets, literal horse faceplates, for battle or selfies if they existed. Meanwhile, the knight, wearing a cracked helm tied with twine. Why? Because the money went to the horse's leg guards. Priorities. And this wasn't just vanity, it was status theater. Your mount was your Instagram profile. The shinier the tack, the holier the rider. Never mind that your chainmail was rusting and your sword was missing half a hilt. If your horse's ears were trimmed and blessed by a priest, you were divine. One chronicler describes a knight whose saddle was lined with fur from a beast he allegedly killed in a dream. Another had a horse blessed by 3 bishops and still died from a peasant's rock. But hey, the horse looked great. Foot soldiers? Forget it. They wore wool, maybe a tunic. Their helmets were glorified cooking pots. Some had no armor at all, just a stick, a prayer, and the hope of looting a corpse with better gear. Meanwhile, nobles paraded in gold trim and imported steel, even if they couldn't swing a sword properly. One knight had his squire carry him because he didn't want to sweat in his ceremonial armor. That squire later joined a monastery. Trauma, probably. There were armored trends too. Templar sleek, Teutonic blocky, French flare, all extra ribbons, less protection. And if your armor wasn't loud enough, don't worry. Some painted Bible verses on their shields, just in case the Saracens didn't know you were holy while you screamed in agony. And yet, in all this mess, the horse always got the VIP treatment. Fed first, groomed daily, bathed in wine during victory feasts. You? Well, you were replaceable. Let's say you're planning a crusade. You've got knights, you've got swords, you've got divine permission to stab people. But you're missing one thing: ships. Enter Venice, the floating merchant empire that saw a crusade and thought, you know what this needs? A profit margin. Venice didn't fight for faith. Venice invested in it. They were the logistics experts, the arms dealers, the cruise directors of holy war. Need ships to get to Jerusalem? Venice would build them, at cost. Nope. With markup, contracts, interest, and a hidden clause that said, we get a city if you can't pay, which happened a lot. Take the Fourth Crusade, the one where crusaders hired Venice to transport them. The plan, go to Egypt, then Jerusalem. The problem, the crusaders couldn't pay. They ran out of money before boarding. So Venice said, no problem. Just attack this random Christian city for us. That city, Zara, a Catholic port and fellow crusade backer. The Pope told them not to. Venice shrugged. The Crusaders did it anyway. Boom. First city sacked. Still not even close to Jerusalem. Then Venice had another idea. Hey, since you're already off course, why not attack Constantinople? You know, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, a Christian city with walls and wealth. The Pope absolutely forbade it. So naturally, they went anyway. In 1204, the Crusaders, broke, distracted, and now part-time pirates, stormed Constantinople. They looted churches, burned libraries, stole relics, crowned a fake emperor, all under Venetian contract. The crusade had officially gone off the rails, funded by commerce, guided by greed. Holy war had become holy real estate flipping. And Venice? Venice got rich. They took ports, islands, trade rights. They installed governors. They shipped the stolen relics home and bragged about it in their piazzas. It wasn't war. It was capitalism with crossbows. Venice didn't save souls. They sold services. They didn't pray. They invoiced. They didn't fight for heaven. They charged rent on the way there. The Crusades weren't just about faith. They were also a business model. And Venice? They franchised it. You've got your armor, your relics, your divine marching orders, You're ready to take the Holy Land for God. And then the weather shows up. Because nothing humbles a self-declared warrior of Christ quite like the sky turning into a spite machine. The Crusades weren't just about fighting humans. They were about surviving whatever atmospheric tantrum came next. Rain, snow, sandstorms, hail, sun that boiled your chainmail like microwave popcorn, all while dragging a rotting mule through someone else's country. Start with Europe. You leave in spring, expecting warmth. Instead, flooded roads, swollen rivers, ankle-deep mud, nights slip down hills, supply carts sink like holy anchors. One chronicler wrote that an entire baggage train was lost to the earth. Translation, they drowned in a ditch. Once you survive the monsoon and chainmail tour, you hit the Middle East and get the opposite. Sun. Endless, screaming sun. No shade, no wind, no water. Your helmet turns into a portable oven, your cloak becomes a sweat rag, and your shoes fuse to your feet. Dehydration was constant. Heat stroke was considered just being pious. One crusader hallucinated a talking saint and followed a goat into the desert. Neither returned. Then came the sandstorms, and not the cool kind. We're talking lose your eyes and sense of direction in 5 seconds kind. Dust in your teeth, nose, and soul. Tents disappeared, horses panicked. One commander tried to fight the sand with his sword, heroic, also useless. Winter didn't help either. Snowstorms hit the Crusaders while crossing Anatolia, remember. No heaters, no wool insulation, and definitely no thermal leggings. Just frostbite, toe loss, and the smell of freezing regret. Some Crusaders lit fires in their helmets to stay warm. Others burned their own siege ladders for heat. One group cooked a cat because it stared at them wrong. That's how you know morale is collapsing. And let's not forget plagues carried by wet weather. Dysentery outbreaks surged after heavy rain. Whole armies reduced to moaning piles of sickness because a cloud got ambitious. Oh, and lightning? Crusaders thought it was God expressing displeasure. At least 3 separate nights were smited mid-prayer. A bishop claimed it was divine punctuation. So, yeah, the weather didn't care about your holy purpose. It didn't recognize your banner. It just hit you with every possible climate condition in the most inconvenient way, and watched you weep in wet wool. Crusaders feared enemy armies. But what they should have feared was the forecast. Let's talk disease. Because if the Crusades were a pilgrimage, it was less journey to redemption and more public health hazard with swords. And the star of this medieval medical meltdown? The boil. You know it. You hate it. You can't avoid it. Crusaders had boils on their legs, necks, backs, and emotional stability. Swollen, infected skin bubbles, packed with pus and holy despair. And they weren't alone. Boils came with friends, fever, fatigue, and the occasional uncontrollable screaming. Crusaders believed these grotesque, oozing afflictions weren't just infections. They were messages from God. Divine punishment. Spiritual trials. One knight, covered in boils, claimed it was proof of the Lord purifying him through agony. His squire said, "He stinks." And they were everywhere. Camps became petri dishes. Shared water, shared tents, shared relics. It all led to shared bacteria. Boils were passed around like medieval party favors. One crusader even started naming his. "This is Saint Ichius," he said, pointing at his shoulder. "He speaks to me at night." He needed help. Treatment? Don't expect mercy. Barbers lanced boils with knives. No sterilization, no painkillers. Just a stick to bite and a priest muttering Latin while the blade plunged in. Sometimes they burned the boil out. Literal fire. That's right. If you got sick, your options were leeching, slicing, or flambe. Herbal remedies included garlic, wine, moldy bread, and hope. Some applied blessed soil. One group of monks smeared chicken dung on boils. Results: inconclusive. Smell: definitive. Worse, nobody understood germ theory. So, instead of isolating the sick, they huddled closer to them. They slept next to them. One guy tried kissing a boil to draw out the sin. He died. Nobody was surprised. The belief was, if you were holy enough, you couldn't get infected. If you did get sick, it meant you weren't praying hard enough. So, naturally, people spent their final hours praying, not treating. But the boils weren't just physical. They were symbolic. Crusaders saw them as badges of honor, proof of suffering, martyrdom via mucus. Some believed boils would burst on the battlefield, releasing their holy pain into the enemy. One priest claimed his oozing leg boil saved 3 men during a siege. He died. Again, no one shocked. And when the dying got worse, they called it God's will. Because in the Crusades, disease wasn't random. It was spiritual inventory. You weren't sick, you were being judged, one festering lump at a time. July 15th, 1099. After years of marching, starving, looting, arguing, and at least one confirmed incident of eating a horse, the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem, the holy city, the goal, the prize, the sacred reason for all this madness. And when they took it, they butchered almost everyone inside. Yeah, this wasn't a dignified liberation. This wasn't a solemn restoration of holy ground. This was a bloodbath disguised as a victory. The Crusaders broke through the walls, charged through the gates, and turned the city into a corpse pile. Muslims, Jews, locals, outsiders, civilians, clergy, didn't matter. If you were breathing, you were a target. If you were hiding, they burned the building down. The chroniclers, they were very enthusiastic. One wrote that the Crusaders rode in blood up to the bridles of their horses. That's not a metaphor, that's a brag. Mosques were desecrated. Synagogues set ablaze, with entire communities inside. Eastern Christians, supposedly allies, were killed just to be safe. One soldier said, "Better to kill one too many than one too few." Very Christ-like, they called it cleansing. A holy act, the final purge. One priest delivered mass on an altar covered in blood and declared the massacre a divine sign of approval. And then they celebrated. Knights paraded through the city. People kissed the ground, and not metaphorically. Literal, sand-covered, blood-slicked ground. Crusaders wept. They thanked God for allowing them to survive the slaughter they just committed. There were speeches, songs. Some probably wrote poems. It was like the world's worst after-party hosted in a smoldering tomb. And this, for the record, was not unusual. This was the standard. This is what liberation looked like in Crusader theology. If the city wasn't soaked in blood, then it hadn't truly been taken for God. But here's the haunting part. They believed they were righteous. They didn't see atrocity. They saw fulfillment, prophecy, reward. They weren't just conquering territory. They thought they were baptizing it in human blood. The First Crusade didn't end in triumph. It ended in moral collapse. And somehow, that's what they remembered as the good part. So you've conquered Jerusalem. Nice work. The churches are ash, the locals are dead, and your boots still squelch with post-massacre goo. Now what? Simple. You set up Crusader states, a kind of feudal Airbnb chain, but with fewer amenities and more siege engines. There were 4 main ones: Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli. Each ruled by a European noble who figured, hey, I murdered enough people, I deserve a castle. They imported European feudalism like it was the latest trend. Lords, vassals, peasant taxes, tournaments, the whole feudal mess, plopped onto a desert full of people who didn't ask for any of this. They tried to make it work, built fortresses, appointed bishops, argued about wine imports. One noble spent a full year building a garden in the middle of a war zone. But the cracks were immediate. First, no one agreed on anything. Every Crusader state had its own laws, its own army, and its own flavor of Christian superiority. They couldn't coordinate, couldn't share resources, and most definitely couldn't pick a single language. Second, they were surrounded by enemies. The locals hated them. Muslim forces regrouped and waited. Byzantine allies resented them. Even Eastern Christians side-eyed their new rulers like, "You're not from around here, are you?" And inside the states, total chaos. Laws contradicted themselves. A priest could sentence you to prison for heresy in the morning and forgive you by lunch if you donated a horse. One baron was excommunicated 3 times and still ran his castle like a frat house. And let's talk infrastructure. Roads, broken, water, contaminated, sanitation. What's that? Most cities had 2 functioning wells and a church built on a demolished mosque that still smelled like ash. Then came the pilgrims. Thousands poured in from Europe, expecting a spiritual experience. Found fleas, food shortages, and civil unrest. One wrote home saying, "Jerusalem is holy, but the bread gave me worms." Another tried to sue a monk over hotel fees. We don't know who won. It was bad enough that some crusaders just left, packed up, went home, said, "It's not you, it's the plague," and never looked back. The Crusader states weren't kingdoms. They were mismanaged relic theme parks with swords. They were Europe's awkward attempt at colonization, poorly maintained and constantly on fire. And eventually, they collapsed. Because even divine real estate can't survive if the tenants are all sword-waving landlords who can't agree on anything except who gets the holy bathtub. So, you survived the Crusades. You marched through Europe. You crossed deserts. You battled Saracens, starvation, dysentery, heat stroke, and your own terrible decisions. And now, you've got no money, a missing leg, and a shaky story about how it was all God's will. Welcome to post-Crusade life, where your biggest reward is survival and disfigurement. Let's talk about those who made it back, the so-called heroes. They didn't return with gold or glory. They returned with permanent damage, inside and out. Most came home wounded, missing fingers, toes, limbs, sometimes all 3. Medieval warfare didn't do clean breaks. If a sword didn't kill you, infection probably would. And if you were lucky enough to survive the amputation, congrats. You're now a one-handed farmer in an economy built on 2-handed labor. And what did people say? "Welcome home, you're holy now. Good luck affording bread." Crusade injuries were everywhere. Stiff necks from helmets, crushed vertebrae from armor, crossbow bolt scars, boils that never really left, eyes gone from battlefield flashes. One guy returned with a mangled jaw and a note that just said, "Bit of mace." That was the vibe. They brought relics too, or what passed for them. Splinters, dirt, possibly a knuckle. One knight returned with a burned piece of robe he claimed was from Christ's tomb. His neighbors said it looked like his shirt. And yes, some did bring home actual loot, if they were high-ranking, lucky, or morally flexible. But most brought home trauma. Physical, spiritual, and deeply existential trauma. Because remember, these weren't professional soldiers. Many were peasants or monks, or bored nobles who thought war would be noble. What they got instead was mass death and a close-up view of humanity's worst instincts. Some returned home and immediately joined monasteries. Others became wanderers. A few just stopped speaking entirely. They had marched across the world for Christ, and came back with hollow eyes and phantom limbs. Wives didn't recognize them. Towns didn't want them. One bishop called returning crusaders the broken fruit of a righteous tree. Another called them reminders of our sin. The church praised them with words, not money, not care, just sermons about sacrifice while the veterans begged outside the abbey for soup. You went to war for God. You came home with a limp, a haunted stare, and a village that didn't care. And that was if you came back at all. The Crusades didn't just end when the swords stopped swinging. They echoed through families, through nations, through theology, through trauma so normalized it became holy tradition. Let's start at the top, the church. The architects of this centuries-long religious fever dream. After promoting mass warfare as a path to salvation, they had a problem. What do you do with generations of people raised on violence in the name of God? Easy. You institutionalize it. You build culture around it. Songs, sermons, pilgrimages. You paint crusaders in stained glass. You write chronicles that turn massacres into moral parables. You don't deal with the trauma, you canonize it. Villages were left without fathers. Families lived with veterans who woke up screaming in Latin. Children grew up on bedtime stories that involved beheadings and boiling oil. Some towns banned torchlight processions because they reminded people of burning cities. But it wasn't just personal trauma, it was societal rot. Europe shifted. Entire generations were raised to believe that violence for God was not just allowed, it was noble. Crusader myths became part of the DNA, chivalry, honor, defending the faith. It all sounds nice until you realize it's just spiritualized warfare with better costumes. And what about the survivors? Most of them weren't heroes, they were broken men who'd seen things that couldn't be cleansed with a confession. Veterans became beggars, hermits. Some were excommunicated for going mad. Others were considered blessed for speaking in tongues, when really they were having breakdowns. Priests didn't call it trauma. They called it divine revelation. One crusader returned home, built a hut in the woods, and refused to wear shoes. He said the ground spoke to him. People visited him like a saint. He died of exposure. There were whispers, of course. People started noticing that returning crusaders weren't right. They drank too much, hurt their families, wandered off mid-sermon. One monk tried to write a book about the black cloud that followed the holy warriors. The Inquisition burned it. The Church doubled down. Suffering purifies. Sacrifice saves. They built monuments instead of hospitals, shrines instead of support. Every scar was a badge, every nightmare. A reminder that you had served God well. This wasn't healing, it was holy gaslighting. And it seeped into law, politics, even architecture. Fortresses everywhere, weapon stockpiles. Generations preparing for the next crusade, because if trauma can't be processed, you just repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it, until the blood dries on someone else's altar. The First Crusade ends. Jerusalem has been painted red. The Crusader states are duct-taped together. People crawl back home with boils, trauma, and questionable relics. So, naturally, everyone declares victory. The Church says, "We did it. Jerusalem is ours. Praise be." The knights say, "We won." Now excuse me while I cough up blood. And the European monarchs who never even went, "Ah, yes, our glorious crusade. We're spiritually responsible." Even the ones who showed up late claimed credit, like turning up after the credits and insisting you starred in the movie. But let's look closer. Did the Church win? Technically, they got Jerusalem, for now. But they also unleashed 2 centuries of religious instability, burned interfaith bridges to the ground, and proved they couldn't control their own holy mob once it left Europe. The Pope got his glory, but also a global migraine. Did the Crusaders win? Well, they seized land, but couldn't govern it, or protect it, or agree on what language to print the road signs in. Every Crusader state was a political dumpster fire. Most were gone within decades, and the ones that survived, constantly under siege and in debt. Plus, half the Crusaders died before even seeing Jerusalem. One knight wrote that he touched the holy soil, and then dropped dead from dysentery. That's not a win, that's irony. Did the Muslims lose? Short term, yes. Jerusalem fell. Cities were sacked, but they regrouped fast. The fractured Muslim world began to unify, and over the next few decades it came back stronger and really, really angry. By the time Saladin entered the chat, the Crusaders were already playing defense. And what about the Jews, the Eastern Christians, civilians? They got nothing. No wins. Just massacres, burned homes, and a permanent reminder that they weren't the right kind of Christian or the right kind of anything. And yet, somehow, every side told themselves they won. Why? Because nobody wanted to admit the truth, that the Crusades were a bloody, chaotic mess driven by ego, fear, and people who mistook vengeance for virtue. So instead they wrote their own endings. Every nation, every monk, every broken knight, we did what God wanted. Even if that looked like a burning church full of corpses. The story of the Crusades isn't a tale of triumph. It's a collective hallucination of victory, and everyone's still talking over each other. So you'd think, after 6 crusades full of death, debt, disaster, and divine disappointment, the church would finally say, you know what? Let's sit this one out. Nope. Enter Crusade number 7, brought to you by Louis IX of France, also known as St. Louis, aka the guy who just couldn't take a hint. In 1248, Louis looked at centuries of failure and said, hold my relic. He raised an army, emptied his treasury, and launched yet another expedition. Not to Jerusalem, not even to Syria. No, he set his sights on Egypt. Why? Strategy, trade routes, and because it hadn't failed there yet. Spoiler, it was a total catastrophe. Louis's fleet landed in Damietta, and at first, things went surprisingly well. They took the city. Crusaders cheered. The Pope wrote a pre-celebration sermon. They hadn't even unpacked their armor yet. Then came the Nile. Turns out, marching across Egypt with no idea how to navigate floodplains, no fresh water, and an overconfidence problem isn't a winning formula. The Crusaders got bogged down in mud. Literally. Horses drowned, wagons collapsed, supplies rotted. People got stuck, like stuck. At one point, Louis ordered a retreat, and half the army couldn't move because their feet were glued in swamp water. Then the Egyptians attacked. Crusader formations crumbled. Disease broke out. Dysentery, again, always dysentery. Soldiers dropped in the mud, one after another, dying as Louis prayed louder. He was eventually captured, yes. The King of France, captured. Ransomed back for a mountain of gold. His army limped home. The survivors described it as the worst spiritual tour in recorded history. And yet, Louis didn't quit. He launched another crusade 20 years later, this time to Tunisia. That one ended with him dying of plague on the beach before the fighting even started. It's like watching someone repeatedly slam into a locked door and say, maybe this time it's a blessing in disguise. The Seventh Crusade wasn't a campaign. It was a cautionary tale with a crown. And it marked the beginning of the end. After that, enthusiasm for crusading started to crack. Funding dried up. Pilgrims stopped volunteering. Merchants got tired of losing ships. Even popes began hesitating. And when popes pause a war, you know it's bad. But the idea of crusading, it never died, Because myth outlives failure, Lewis was canonized. His loss, reframed as spiritual victory. His death, a martyr's moment. His crusade, a trial by God. Convenient branding. Because if you just rebrand failure as faith, you never have to change strategy. You just have to keep marching. Even if no one remembers where you were going. You'd think, after hundreds of years, the Crusades would be just a footnote. A medieval fever dream filed under "Oops" in history books. And yet, they're still here. Not in chainmail, not with swords, but in politics, rhetoric, and cultural tension that just won't die. Let's start with the obvious: East versus West. The Crusades didn't invent it, but they supercharged it. They institutionalized suspicion, set religions against each other in ways we still see echoed in headlines. Think wars, occupations, and every time a politician says clash of civilizations with a weird smirk. It's not just historical baggage, it's weaponized memory. In many parts of the Muslim world, crusader is still an insult. Shorthand for Western invader, religious imperialist, or that guy who insists on building an embassy on your sacred ground. The term appears in speeches, protests, even graffiti. It's a ghost that keeps getting reanimated. And in the West, crusade rhetoric never really left. Politicians still use it. Crusade for freedom. Crusade for democracy. Crusade against drugs. The word sells purpose, urgency, drama, and sometimes a convenient excuse for blowing something up in the name of good intentions. The cultural scars run deeper than war zones. Take Jerusalem. Still contested, still sacred, still full of tension shaped by centuries of blood, theology, and trauma. The Crusades helped lock it in, not as a shared symbol, but as a battleground of divine real estate. Education, same problem. In European textbooks, crusaders are often painted as gallant, noble, brave, less war criminals in matching uniforms, more heroes of the cross. The Muslim side? Usually flattened into villains, infidels, or defenders who oddly didn't like being invaded. It's sanitized, whitewashed, romanticized, because myths are cleaner than massacres. And so we carry forward a legacy of misunderstanding, fear, and political mythology, one that still influences foreign policy, global conflict, and why some people think history class should come with a helmet. Oh, and religion? Still using crusade logic. Convert or die has just evolved into more subtle tactics: cultural assimilation, targeted propaganda, or missionary programs with marketing teams. The Crusades never ended. They mutated into ideology, into slogans, into that unspoken tension every time someone says Holy Land like they own the deed. And unless we start remembering the Crusades for what they were, not sacred quests but messy, violent, politically engineered catastrophes, we're doomed to keep rerunning them in new costumes. The fallout isn't in ruins, it's in us. You've done well. You've marched the full medieval mile. You've witnessed the carnage, the rot, the prayers whispered over broken helmets and body piles. And now, you're tired. Deservedly so. So lay down, sweet sinner, let's reflect. You woke up in straw, covered in lice. You marched for miles with blisters that could apply for sainthood. You fought for a holy cause no one could actually define in under 5 minutes. And when the fighting stopped, you found out the winners were usually the ones who lied best. You saw priests bless swords. You saw kings cry in mud. You saw sacred relics traded for stale bread. You saw popes rewrite failure as glory, and knights canonize violence with embroidered flags. You've earned your rest. Because the truth is, the Crusades weren't spiritual enlightenment. They were organized chaos with a marketing team. Men died for cities they'd never seen, for languages they didn't speak, for leaders who wouldn't remember their names. And still they marched, through fire, through rain, through theology and dysentery. Some came home broken, some didn't come home at all. Some were buried in unmarked pits beneath churches they never prayed in. But you made it. You walked beside them, in thought and curiosity, in that dark, ironic way that history likes to whisper to the back of your brain at 2 a.m. You saw the holy unravel. You saw saints become tyrants. You saw mercy get lost somewhere between Antioch and Jerusalem, probably under a pile of burnt scrolls and someone's left arm. And now, here at the end, you can rest. Not because the Crusades make sense, but because you survived the story. So pull the blanket over your shoulders. Listen to the sound of medieval silence, wind through shattered towers, maybe a monk mumbling something in Latin, or a horse quietly chewing a relic it wasn't supposed to touch. Close your eyes. Let the past be the problem of daylight. Sleep now, blessed sinner. You've made it through the longest, itchiest, bloodiest bedtime story ever told. And if you dream of swords, or saints, or cities on fire, don't worry, it's just history, burning quietly in the corner of your mind. Good night.